In a minute or two, we gon' enter in you.
In the nude, when we intrude, don't mean to be rude.
While every generation claims that the era of music they grew up listening to is the best,
DJ Khaled! We the best music.
there is an objective argument to be made that certain decades definitely had better music than others.
I'm really happy for you. I'm gonna let you finish. But Beyonce had one of the best videos of all time.
The best era for hip-hop music ever occurred in the early to mid-90s.
I don't remember it.
From Dr. Dre to Tupac on the West Coast to the Notorious B.I.G, Nas, and groups like the Wu-Tang Clan on the East, there are countless classic hip-hop albums from that period. So let's take a look at why 90s hip-hop is the best.
I feel it a butterfly in my stomach and
It had a message.
There's no way that these people should own planes and their people don't have houses.
You'd think that with all the activism going on right now, such as Never Again and Black Lives Matter, that the top rappers in the game would be focusing a lot more on social issues instead of releasing songs like Hotline Bling.
What's your thought on Black Lives Matter?
What is it? What do you mean?
The simple fact is, modern-day rappers are tightly integrated with corporations, and because of that, they really don't want to rub anyone the wrong way and interrupt the flow of money they receive from merchandising, sponsorships, and concert promoters.
My life matters, especially to my
The music industry isn't what it was even in the 90s, and so it is understandable that musicians can't rely on the sales of their albums the way that rappers did in the 90s, a lot of which was driven by controversy that helped their albums seem cool to kids in the suburbs, not to mention the people that were buying them just to burn them in protest. Regardless, a lot of the top artists in the game in the 90s had a message, and considering all the movements championing social justice, it's pretty amazing and sad that rappers like Tupac and Ice-T were getting admonished in the 90s for things that are only now being openly discussed in white society. Because of the lack of support, it really made it even more impressive that rappers were willing to talk about things like that, as they not only fell on mostly deaf ears, but they also created a backlash that was unprecedented at the time, as we'll see in the next entry. There are and have been rappers that focused on social issues since, and there aren't really any rappers that are mainstream and popular that are releasing singles like Tupac's Brenda's Got a Baby or Keep Your Head Up, or his first posthumous single, Changes. The main thing wasn't just that 90s rappers released these songs as singles, but that they made classic songs that were actually really great to listen to as well. It took a certain balance that seems to be off these days. Before we go on, make sure to hit that subscribe button and click that notification bell. It had real consequences.
Making money off a record that is suggesting it's okay to kill cops, and that is wrong.
Most rappers were anti-establishment back in the 90s, as opposed to being fully integrated into the few corporations left that produce and release music these days. While there are a few rappers that have forged their own path, such as Chance the Rapper or the Rhymesayers crew in Minneapolis, the truth is that rappers are a lot more mainstream than they were back in the day. Case in point, Snoop Dogg hosting a game show and Ice-T playing a cop on television.
The answer is eyes. You're correct.
That rebellion in the 90s took guts, and there were real consequences behind the actions those rappers took, as both politicians on either side of the political spectrum were targeting rap as an especially dangerous cancer for the youth.
This music is drug-driven, greed-driven, and violence-driven.
Between Republican Dan Quayle and people on the left like Al Gore's ex-wife Tipper,
Explicit sexual or violent lyrics.
Hillary Clinton, and Al Gore's vice presidential nominee in Joe Lieberman, rap was basically public enemy number one in the 90s. That led to consequences like the FBI following rappers like Tupac Shakur and Notorious B.I.G, to the point that they were trailing both when they were murdered, yet somehow didn't intervene or provide any useful information to the police that were investigating those deaths. Shakur's FBI file is available online and is really, really long, especially for a musician. To be fair, most famous people have an FBI file mostly because of the death threats they receive. It took real guts to release music that continued to focus on the topics that people were up in arms about, and it actually gave some rappers topics to discuss on their albums. Tupac's Wonder Why They Call You Bitch is a great example. Especially considering rappers like Shakur were sued when people did things while under the influence of his music.
There's no doubt in my mind that rap music played a role in this killing.
In case you didn't know, he was sued after someone who had his tape in the tape deck of their car killed a police officer. Those consequences made their music feel even more relevant and genuine, and that's something that just doesn't exist anymore. The albums were albums. Some of the greatest rock albums of all time feel like one long adventure as the songs seem to blend together, even if you're not on LSD. The Dark Side of the Moon, for example, never really had any downtime between songs, which is why it syncs up so well with The Wizard of Oz.
I'm melting! Melting! Oh, what a world! What a world!
The reason for that is because after the Beatles transitioned from a pop group to a rock group and started actually focusing on albums as a whole, as opposed to albums as a way to sell singles with filler in between, musicians started focusing on albums that way as well. The same thing goes for hip-hop albums, as they started out just doing the same thing, pushing singles and having no overall concept for their albums. That changed in the 90s though, or at least it reached its peak in the 90s, with hip-hop albums not only having a lot less filler, or at least intentional filler, but also having concepts. Wu-Tang's 36 Chambers is a great example of this, as is Notorious B.I.G's Ready to Die and Tupac Machiavelli's Don Killuminati, The 7-Day Theory. The latter of which is a lot like The Dark Side of the Moon in that if you listen from beginning to end, there's really no gap between songs, and there are things you'll miss if you skip ahead. To be fair though, the realities of the music business are completely different than they were back during the mid-90s, as artists have to focus on the amount of streams their songs could generate, and because of that, albums as a whole aren't as important as they used to be, as people no longer have to buy entire albums to access songs they like, so you have to take that into account. They told stories.
The most beautiful things are not these objects. The most beautiful things are inside.
While the heyday of storytelling rap was really the 80s, with most early raps being stories or hype songs, like most things, hip-hop of the 90s not only improved on storytelling, but also perfected it. It may be blasphemy to not give Slick Rick credit for being the best storyteller in the game, especially considering that his classic album, The Art of Storytelling, was released in the 90s. One of the main differences between what 80s and 90s rappers were doing in terms of storytelling is the content of those stories. While it did become a cop-out for a lot of rappers to talk about whatever they wanted while saying, "I'm just talking about what I see," the truth is that a lot of GOAT rappers were in fact discussing the bleak realities of living in the inner city in the era of crack cocaine.
Can we have one night where there ain't no fight, nobody gets shot?
Shut up.
Just look at Notorious B.I.G's first album, Ready to Die. That really shows not only what his life was like as a crack dealer, but also the pressure he felt as a young father whose mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. Tupac Shakur, who was known as a walking contradiction because of the difference between his storytelling songs and his party songs, the former of which was really pro-woman with songs like Keep Your Head Up or Brenda's Got a Baby, the latter of which talked about sleeping around with women, like I Get Around, for example, also did a great job of projecting the mindset of a young black man whose mother was addicted to crack and who had multiple negative run-ins with objectively bad police. As an example, he sued the Oakland Police Department for brutality and won. The competition was real.
We rap to make money. We do business. Ain't no other record company out there that sold as many records as we did. We outsold Bad Boy.
Today's hip-hop, as compared to 90s hip-hop, can best be compared to NBA today versus the NBA of the 90s, otherwise known as Michael Jordan's NBA. Outside of people like 50 Cent, who uses beef to stay as close to relevant as he can, most rappers today aren't really competing with one another as much as they're copying and or collaborating with one another. Like the theory of capitalism, competition is actually a good thing because it breeds innovation and change. So, while there are obvious downsides to that competition as well, I'm thinking of East Coast West Coast war here, when you had people like Tupac and Biggie competing against not only one another but other rappers like Nas, you'll see just how helpful competition can be when it comes to the rap game. That extends to the production side as well, as producers in the 90s never rested on their laurels, but rather kept improving their output as not to become stale or fall behind in what was a fast-changing game. After both Tupac and Biggie died, people no longer had the two best MCs of all time to compare themselves to, and because of that, some rappers fell off, with Nas unfortunately being the best example. When he suddenly had to compete against someone again, he came back with such a vengeance that he created a new verb, getting ethered. Hip-hop needs more of that. But it's understandable why people moved away from it, as both Tupac and Biggie died because of their intense competition, and people like 50 Cent really just made beef in a cheap way to get attention before an album was ready to drop. It was innovative.
Do you want backup singing in my band?
I want you to back up what just happened and tell me exactly.
Hip-hop, more than any other form of music, is a consistently changing art form. The type and sound of what's popular, even now, changes from year to year. And because of that, rappers have the same job security of anyone working in Trump's White House. Yikes. The difference between hip-hop today and hip-hop from the 90s is that today's hip-hop really just jumps from trend to trend, from crunk to sing-songy rap, think Ja Rule and then Try Not to Shudder, to the high-pitched chorus of Kanye West beats, whereas 90s rap seemed to change based on a natural evolution that comes from competition and creativity. Compare Dr. Dre's production on NWA's first album to what he did with Death Row, and you'll see a natural evolution that is a lot like what the Beatles were doing in the late 60s. Today's hip-hop seems to jump really from city to city, thanks to the advent of the internet and how easy it is for anyone to create and disseminate their music. Because of that, rappers and producers tend to copy whatever type of sound is popular that month. There are obvious exceptions to that, like Kendrick Lamar, but you only have to look at one of his mentors to see why he's really able to ignore the flavor of the month and focus on his craft. Hint, it's Dr. Dre. A perfect example of this is looking at how every rapper sounded after both Drake and Future appeared on the scene, and then compare that to the 90s, where every rapper had their own distinctive sound that didn't sound like anyone else. There were groups.
Check this out. It's the Wu-Tang Clan, you know what I'm saying? From the Shaolin, you know what I'm saying?
During the late 90s and early aughts, the typical evolution of a rapper's career was to drop a debut album, wait for that to blow up, start one's own record label, and then release an album with whatever group they put together with friends from their childhood. Examples of that are nearly endless, with Nelly and the St. Lunatics, 50 Cent and G-Unit, Eminem and D12 being prime examples of that. Before that, though, there were actual groups that started out as groups, and then, depending on the success of their albums, they might have a solo album every couple of years while they were still part of the original group. The best example of that is the Wu-Tang Clan, which debuted with one of the best albums of all time, with 36 Chambers. After that album blew up, there were, and still are, albums from group members like Method Man, RZA, Ghostface Killah, Old Dirty Bastard, and GZA. There was NWA, which technically was formed in its prime in the late 80s, Mobb Deep, Thug Life, Junior Mafia, Live Squad, The Outlaws, Cypress Hill, De La Soul, A Tribe Called Quest, and many more. Another difference besides how these groups were formed as compared to the groups from the 2000s is the fact that these groups actually produced amazing albums. Most of the more modern groups' albums had a lot of filler, with songs that you really only listen to in order to hear the star of the group, like Eminem or Nelly, to a much lesser extent. Whereas groups like Wu-Tang really had no weak members and no filler songs. If you don't believe me, compare Mobb Deep's The Infamous or Hell on Earth to St. Lunatic's albums. Rebellion versus The Institution.
And maybe 2 or 3 seconds went by, and he just went, "Hi, my name is..."
Today's hip-hop has been described as corporate hip-hop, because most of the biggest rappers are really all about making money, and while they may rap about things like drugs and women, often in a profane way, they're really not focusing on things like social issues or taking on the establishment, as they've basically become the establishment. The best example of this is the fact that former President Barack Obama had Jay-Z at the White House on numerous occasions, and while Eazy-E did visit the White House as well, it wasn't done as a casual invite, but rather as a way to discuss the effects of gangster rap on the youth. That's because the first Bush White House had made an issue out of rap music, namely rap music that targeted police. Rappers like Ice-T, whose song Cop Killer, which was, to be fair, actually a rock song with his band Body Count, started a national debate about free speech as it applied to music. Bush's vice president was Dan Quayle, who discussed Tupac Shakur on national television, which may or may not have been the reason that the FBI was actually investigating Tupac and other rappers like the Notorious B.I.G. Beyond that, there were actual hip-hop cops in cities like New York, whose only job was to investigate the rappers' connection to the guns and drug trade, as well as their connection to organized crime. You had groups like NWA, and especially Public Enemy, that rapped about real issues. Tupac Shakur, for example, had multiple songs removed from his earlier albums, namely Thug Life Volume 1. Because of the fervor over his music, all that led to Warner Brothers dropping Interscope Records after people protested outside of their headquarters. Considering how profitable Interscope became, I'm sure they regret that decision now. Producers and beats.
I don't know what it was, but whenever we got in the studio, he would play me and I'd be like, yo, that's crazy.
One of the main differences between 90s hip-hop and today's rap is the fact that a lot of the producers back then were as famous as the MCs they were working with. While that did extend into the early 2000s with people like Scott Storch, there aren't really a ton of producers out there today that were on that level. People like Dr. Dre, DJ Premier, Daz Dillinger, DJ Quick, DJ Muggs, Johnny J, Timbaland, Q-Tip, RZA, Pete Rock, and Jay Dilla produced some of the best music ever. That's because they took immense risks and were really experimenting with music in ways that producers these days simply don't. They were at the point in the evolution of the genre where they were being rewarded for experimentation because they cared more about the craft than they did about how well a certain song performed on the charts or the radio. They pushed one another to try new things and create things that people had never heard before. Because of that, 90s hip-hop still sounds amazing. It had the goats.
What you're about to witness, New York City, Detroit, history.
The main reason that 90s hip-hop is the best really boils down to the fact that the MCs that were around back then were just straight up amazing. If you go to any rap video on YouTube and check the comments, you'll eventually run into a comment, or 500, that state that whichever rapper whose video you're watching wouldn't exist if Tupac or Biggie were still alive. And while that's probably a mix between hyperbole and wishful thinking, those people have a point. The death of both Tupac Shakur and Biggie Smalls left a void in the rap game that was filled by rappers like Jay-Z and DMX, and that changed the trajectory of the entire genre. Imagine the Beatles dying in a plane crash in 1964 before they'd reached their prime in their late 20s. That's what happened with Shakur and Smalls, who were 25 and 24 respectively when they were gunned down. Despite their young age, the two produced what is considered the best hip-hop music that the world has ever seen. Their music was so good that they were considered leaps and bounds ahead of people like Nas, whose Illmatic album is on most every top 10 hip-hop albums list. Then you have Snoop Dogg in his prime, Dr. Dre's The Chronic, and G-Funk Style, and amazing groups like the Wu-Tang Clan's 36 Chambers and Mobb Deep. The talent was so amazing, and the classics were being released month after month. That's something that'll never happen again, and that's really the reason why 90s hip-hop is the best. You gotta be feeling fly after that. So hit that subscribe button and click that notification bell so you don't miss another video. Appreciate you watching. Don't forget to leave a comment. Catch you next time.